I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I record this podcast, the land of the Kabi Kabi peoples. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of country and their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Here on the Smart Community podcast, we talk about data, technology, communities, and the future. First Nations peoples have been sharing knowledge, caring for country, and telling stories for tens of thousands of years. I honour that deep connection to storytelling and community connection as we continue our conversation together here today. Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community podcast, I have a brilliant discussion with Paul Hodge, also known as the Data Viz Guy. Paul is an independent consultant specialising in education and mentoring around data visualisation and storytelling, working with global organisations and state and federal government agencies. In this episode, Paul tells us about the 3 core principles of his training, the importance of defining specific audiences rather than being too general, and the simplest storytelling framework. We finish our chat discussing impactful visualizations like the algorithmically determined name placement at the 9/11 Memorial in New York. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns, and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Paul. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you very much. And it's great to be here with you. I'm looking forward to today.
Me too. Let's just jump straight in. And can you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Paul Hodge, aka the Data Viz Guy is my sort of handle that I go by. I'm an independent consultant, I guess would be the best way to describe myself. And currently my focus is primarily on education and mentoring. So I work with a lot of either global organizations or a number of state and federal government sort of organizations as well. And I teach them a variety of principles around data visualization and data storytelling, along with some sessions specifically around tools, most recently around Power BI as one of the sort of the preferred tools out there. And then I also provide a number of supporting things that go along with that. As I said, things like mentoring sessions where people are actually building out real examples using their own data, and I help them with regular mentoring sessions, and also helping them. There's a lot of organizations these days that are building out their community of practice. So I participate with helping moderate some of those sessions and also providing little keynote speeches in there, but we also try and coordinate in external speakers and that sort of stuff to basically keep a alive and active community of practice around, again, data visualization, storytelling, and general data analysis. So that's broadly speaking what I do.
Yeah, wow. So many things there. I want to kind of just go straight to when you're working with clients. You talked about giving them principles of data visualization and storytelling. Can we start there and just discuss some of those principles that
absolutely. I've got about so it's a sort of formal. It's a formal class. We'll call it a formal class. Typically runs over 3 half days, and the core of the course sort of focuses on establishing a common vocabulary. One of the things that I think I've established fairly quickly or over time, really. Prior to this life that I'm in now, I was a consultant for many, many, many years, more years than I like to count sometimes, and worked over in America, worked in Europe, worked around Asia, that sort of stuff as well. And one of the things that I sort of noticed was that a lot of people have a very basic vocabulary around data visualization. Like people can identify a pie chart and a line chart and a bar chart and that sort of stuff, but they don't have a really extensive vocabulary when it comes to describing what they're trying to build and why they're trying to build it and And so it's difficult for them to know when they're doing the right thing and maybe what areas they could be improving on. So basically the class has 3 big principal sort of areas that we focus on. And that is, how do we engage the audience and how do we keep their attention? So the principle being, the longer that we can keep people's attention, the more likely we are to communicate interesting insights to them. So one thing is getting their attention and holding that attention. The second principle is, how do we then deliver interesting information and ideally insights rather than just simply more data? So I want to sort of try and transition people to communicating insights rather than just simply data. And then the third principle is really about bringing all that together through some design thinking. And so meaning that if I've got a good story and I've got some good information, if I don't present that well, then it might lose its message as well. So we want things to be well presented. Some of that's cosmetic, but also some of it is to do with the hierarchy of information and what information is more important than other information and that sort of stuff. And so that's what the class is really principally about. And the objective at the end of the class is that the team and or the organization overall now has a sort of a common vocabulary and framework to then think about how to capture requirements and how to do personal and group critiques and that sort of stuff in a way that's constructive and goal-focused. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And what kinds of, I guess, for your client's perspective, when they're coming to this class, are they coming already with issues and problems that they want to use data to solve, or is it more, or is it a bit of a combination of some people are there because they want to learn more about data and how to visualize, or are some people coming there with the problem that they want to use data to solve?
It's probably all of the above, right? Yeah. But I think there's probably, let's see if I can come up with probably, I would summarize it to 2 big audiences probably, right? One would be some groups just simply have a mission that they're on at the moment around general data literacy, right? So they're trying to improve the base level data literacy of their organization overall, right? So therefore, they're not coming at it with a particular problem. I mean, having said that, there's probably a set of problems or opportunities that have prompted them to want to be more data literate, but they don't come to me with that problem initially. What they do is they might come to me and say, hey, we've got a program that we're running. We're trying to generally raise the data literacy across the organization. And we think your offering or some of the things you can bring to the table would help us raise that level of literacy. So, the rising tide lifts all boats sort of type principle, right? The second group, I would say, is a little bit more problem driven. And that might be especially where the organization maybe has a very technical group who are very good data analysts, and they sort of lack the ability to communicate their insights effectively, right? And that's a little bit more problem driven specifically, where they're sort of saying, okay, we've got a gap in our ability to turn these very insightful pieces of data that people collected or insights that they've got, but they're not very good. They're very technical and they're not very good at presenting that in a humanistic way and delivering it to their audience. So I would say they're the sort of the 2 groups, one being sort of just general capability and the other one being a little bit more problem-centric, probably more associated with these data analysts and those sorts of things who are not as business au fait and not as I said, humanistically focused.
So it's using, I guess, that data visualization piece as that kind of common language that like they're both learning a common language that then they can communicate with, say, with the technology kind of focused people.
That's certainly the way that I'm positioning it, at least anyway, is that, the first step to creating a solution is having at least the words that you can use to describe the problem. Then they have to practice that and put it into practice. But yes, I think creating the vocabulary and that framework for thinking as much as anything else, right? So I call it a vocabulary. but in fact, it's a framework for thinking, is what it really ultimately is. So hopefully people then, come away from it, whether it's, general capabilities sort of thinking, or whether it's a specific problem that they're trying to solve, a better presentation that they're trying to do, that hopefully now they have a framework of thinking about, okay, yes, I hadn't thought about, what the audience actually wanted. All I did was I did a whole lot of statistical analysis, and I came up with some interesting insights, and I thought that would be interesting to them, without sort of thinking more about, what their business goals were and those sorts of things. And then also at the other end of the equation, meaning that, okay, now I do understand what they need, and I've got some good information that I want to present, and I think I've got some good charts, but how could I, present that more effectively, a little bit more professionally, arguably, right? And do it in a way that's cohesive. And that might mean there are some fundamental things in there that they have to understand, things like appropriate color usage, that again, a technical person might present a very good chart, but they might not have thought about color blindness, and they might not have thought about consistency of the colors across different visualizations and that sort of stuff. So the design aspect does sort of flow in there afterwards as well.
Yeah, I guess understanding the audience and I guess who's involved, so both from a creator perspective, but then also who's taking in that information. Is that something, well, you just touched on that, you bring that in and people might not have thought about their audience per se. What kinds of things do you need to consider when creating visualizations for a particular audience?
Yeah, I think it's actually, interestingly enough, and I wouldn't have thought it was necessarily the case, but this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges that people have. And it has layers to it, right? So it might not be a stretch for them to say, oh, well, I have thought about who the audience is going to be, right? So that might not be a big stretch. I think the stretch, though, that I think most people don't think about strongly enough is the why. The why is somebody interested in it. And when they start to think about that, they might say, oh, no, I've thought about that. I've thought, why they want it is they want to know the trend here, or they want to know, the most likely outcome, or they want to know something like that. And I say to them, okay, you're talking a lot about questions that you're trying to answer here, right? Which is great. And there's no doubt your audience wants to answer those questions. So that's definitely something that they want. But why do they want it? What is the decision that they need to make? What is the action that they're going to take, right? And that starts to stretch them a little bit more, because most of the audiences are comfortable with saying, oh, yeah, no, what they want to know is they definitely want to know a trend, or they want to know a comparison, or they want to understand where the outliers are and that sort of stuff. So they definitely understand the questions they're trying to answer, but they're not always specifically thinking about why they need that information. And one of the things that I try to do is to encourage them to, before they start thinking about the questions that they're going to ask, I ask them to think about, if you were that person, why do you want that information? Is it that you need to understand where you need to direct certain resources towards, or is it because you need to understand what projects might need further investigation because they seem to be in distress, or is it about maybe looking for opportunities in a regulatory policy that might need refinement, right? Because there might be just because there's a trend in the data that suggests that Australians in regional areas using mobile phones more to consume video than people in metropolitan areas are. Well, that's an interesting insight, but why would I want to know that? Well, I'd want to know that because I'd want to look at some of the digital divide policies that exist in the government and understand whether or not the fact that there is that trend towards using mobile more in regions, how are we actually supporting that through a policy perspective? So I think the bigger issue is not that they're not necessarily thinking about their audience, but that they're not thinking about why the audience needs it. They're thinking more about what the opportunity is they have to deliver some information. right? Thinking about, well, what are they going to do with that information when I get it? And by flipping that mindset around a little bit, it helps them understand a little bit more about why the visuals that they produce later on might be useful or not, because now they're thinking more about the purpose rather than the question they were trying to answer.
Yeah, that's really, thanks for explaining it that way. It made it super clear. It's more around them thinking about the action that needs to be taken by their audience or by that decision or whoever it is, rather than the questions that they're asking. The questions are obviously important. They need to know those as well. But then, yeah, what action am I going to take with that? And whatever story I'm getting or whatever whatever insight I'm getting from that visualization, is it enough to help me to take that action, or are there other things that need to be also provided to help me or to support that action being made?
Absolutely. If they start thinking about some of those basic principles of why, exactly to your point, is that sometimes it even questions whether or not they actually have the right data now, because I didn't really, I was just trying to answer the questions based on the data that I had, which might be all they can do. But they might start to realize now that, now that you actually want to know that, this is why you need to know that. Maybe I need to go and get some other data that would also help support that. So it starts to question even, whether what they've done is actually now useful. And that's really the point, right? The point is that what you want, one of the things I finish my sort of sessions on saying is that anything you produce should have really two objectives. It should be both useful and it should be usable. And so that's the sort of the key balancing point there. And so sometimes this idea of why I'm doing it in the first place sort of starts to question whether or not what they've done is actually useful in the first place. And it might force them to go back and think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. From that, I guess, standpoint of being useful and usable, when you are, I guess, working with clients, can you give us any examples of, I guess, problems that they've been trying to solve or impact that, say, visualizations or storytelling has had?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the sort of scenarios that I've been talking about, I think are really very much what we're sort of talking about in terms of the actual benefits that come out of it. So I can't go into specifics because I can't talk about an individual client and what they've achieved. But what I can say, though, is that there's always lots of little sort of anecdotal stories, but I think one of them that is very tangible, and it's a very simple one, really, is there was a particular group who were looking at their data assets, managing their data assets overall. So it's a fairly sort of, it's not rocket science or anything like that, but they had several hundred data assets across their organization. And they had a register of those assets sitting in effectively a spreadsheet, right? And the challenge that the person who was sort of trying to present that information was that they wanted to sort of take that spreadsheet and they wanted to create an interactive visualization around that. And I said, well, that's great. Okay. And they had just simply started to put together charts, that had pie charts on it and line charts on it. It was something that they thought looked really interesting and engaging and all that sort of stuff. And it was really, it became, I often call them the sort of the passion fruit visualization, right? It was just a whole lot of colors without much meaning and all of that sort of stuff. And so we pulled it back to basic principles again. And I said, look, let's first of all define at least one audience member, right? Now, I think another one of these challenges, and this is sort of fundamental to creating a good outcome at the end, again, is this audience definition. There are a bunch of challenges around this audience definition area, because the success of your project is going to depend on how well you've defined this audience. A couple of challenges that people have is, number one, is they often become a little bit too generic with their audience. So they might say their audience is the public. Okay, great. Or they might say the audience is the organization is the audience, right? And immediately I'll say one of the things about audiences when you're trying to define your audience is I would argue it's better to be too specific than too general, meaning that if you make it very specific for an individual person, at least you know what you're creating is going to be of benefit to that one person. If you make it too general, then what happens is it's not necessarily a benefit to anybody because you've made it too average. And the risks that you end up doing when you're too average, when you sort of don't have a specific audience in mind, is that you try and make it work for everyone. And what that ends up doing is it probably actually makes it more complex than it needs to be because now you've added in too many filters and you've put too many visuals on there because you're trying to appeal to every possible group with every dimension of data and all of that sort of stuff, rather than saying one particular audience member. And the reality is once you build it for that one audience member, it's likely to be generally useful to other people, but now you've made it specifically useful to one person. So in this particular scenario, what we did was we ended up saying, okay, the one person that we're going to make it for is going to be the head of the division, right? Not everybody, that person, right? And what that led us to point towards was focusing a lot more on how do we display the portfolio but highlight the highest risk data assets. Not every data asset, because the general manager or the manager of the organization isn't interested in every data asset. They're probably most interested in the ones that have the greatest value to the organization and maybe have the highest risk to the organization. So we ended up creating a visualization that was very focused around that particular person. And by doing that, we created a heat map that was more risk-oriented. We got rid of all of the, these other pie charts and all that sort of stuff. And we basically focused it around a particular heat map sort of style visualization. And we also ended up, by looking at this heat map, we ended up identifying the most critical assets that were of the highest business value and that had the highest confidentiality or highest risk aspect to them. And it turned out there was only one of those, which was good, which meant the organization was relatively unexposed or didn't have a high level of exposure. And we were able to then put that in a little counter, like a KPI of sorts, that said, you have one of those. And the advantage of that was when we published this particular report to their internal portal, they were also, the executive was also able to put an alert on that number that says, if that number ever changes, I want an immediate alert, because I want to know if somebody ends up adding another asset to our register, which is of critical business value and extraordinarily high risk. If that happens, I want to know about it immediately. And so now the report became much more action-oriented. It became very specific for that individual. And it meant that now the executive had a little bit more confidence that they were aware of what was happening in the organization. They had high level of confidence that if the balance of that portfolio changed, that they would get an alert. And it became a very useful sort of report. So that's one sort of example. Does that make sense, Zoe?
Yeah, that's and it's a really great example because I think it shows the power of the visualization in the sense of, one, the audience being very specific. I think that's really powerful and a really great insight. But also, I imagine that they didn't know potentially that they only had one of these really high risk assets at the time. And then that visualization then exposed that, for want of a better word, from a risk perspective, but exposed that they only had one. Therefore, then they were able to make a better decision about, I just need to alert about this one, rather than maybe they're overwhelmed thinking, oh my God, I've got all of these assets. Oh, I've got all this risk. What am I going to do? Whereas through that visualization, they were able to.
There's two things that came from it, I think. One was a sense of confidence that I understand. So the executive was a little bit more confident that they understood the portfolio. Was one aspect. And to your point, the other aspect was that if they had found out that there was 3 of these things or 5 of these, they would have taken an action to maybe try and remediate that, right? They would have said, really, do we have 5 data assets that are critical business value that are highly confidential? Why do we have 3 of these? And so it very easily led to decisions and actions because the portfolio is more presented in that way that sort of talked about where does my focus need to be. And prior to that, if they were asked that same question, they would have had to go to that spreadsheet and they would have had to filter one column, by high business value, and they would have had to go to the other column and filter by high risk value, and then see, there's one of them there, right? Whereas with the way that it was presented by the end result, they had that portfolio view very, very quickly based on the heat map with the numbers on the heat map, and they were able to quickly, look around and see where the exposure was. They were also, by the way, able to very quickly identify the number of assets that hadn't been qualified properly either, right? So they were able to look for gaps and then immediately say, hey, I expect those gaps to be filled. Can you please make sure that the data stewards have all of these unclassified data assets that are in our register that haven't been classified, or maybe they've been classified as a high business value, but they haven't yet been classified with a risk value. So how do I know whether they're something I should be aware of or not, right? So they were able to identify gaps as well as places for attention. So yeah, it became very actionable from the executive. And as you can imagine now, given that it was of value to the executive, right, it was also of value to the executive's direct reports, because those direct reports didn't want to be driven by the executive. They wanted to be now proactive and say, well, if there's going to be any of these gaps, I don't want them in my department. And so while it was targeted at the value of one person, it became useful to a lot of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And it then gives, again, that shared kind of understanding of looking at, because I'm imagining if there's a big spreadsheet of these things and they go, there's only one filter, maybe I've made a mistake with my filters, or maybe I need to ask, whereas now it's like, if we agree, and it's all obviously checked and balanced, rigorous process of creating the visualization, I trust that then I can use this visualizations to make the decision or ask another question.
Yes, or to be made aware of a change that maybe is going to generate an action for me, right? So I can immediately respond to something rather than having to wait, until the next quarterly review or something, rather to suddenly find out we've got 5 more assets that I wasn't aware of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a little bit about, we've talked, and I guess we've been using data visualization and storytelling and the use of narrative as well. Can you give us a little bit of, your definition of what is storytelling as opposed to, say, just a data visualization?
Yeah, so it is it's an interesting aspect, right? But a lot more people are asking, by the way, about storytelling than they are about data visualization these days, right? So I'm not sure if it's a buzzword or not. I think it definitely has value in it, and I think it can be defined in the sense that storytelling is, I think fundamentally, it's the idea of taking individual insights and providing them in some context, right? And how the story then flows can depend a little bit, right? So there's a great quote from one of the directors, I've forgotten who it is now, it might be Tarantino or somebody like that says, all stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. So narrative and story it can be sort of fluid in the way that it's presented. So some people might say, oh, my story, I like to start with the executive summary. So I like to tell them the answer first and then go and, explain the details later. Whereas other people might say, well, I'm going to provide an introduction and then I'm going to provide some individual insights and then I'll present a conclusion, right? So story and narrative can have different flows. But ultimately, it comes back to what I said initially, which is that I think the difference between data visualization and story is that data visualization is about an individual insight. Story is about presenting that insight in the context of a broader context. And the best, simplest way that I tend to describe story is there's a gentleman who has a book, and I think his name is Randy Olson. and it's called Narrative is Everything, is the book. And it's Randy was actually initially a marine biologist, and one of the things that he'd been doing is he'd been reading a lot of white papers and research papers that people had written, and he said that they were very dry. They were full of facts, but they were very dry. They weren't very interesting to read, and they became a bit repetitive, and it was difficult to understand what the key points were and all that sort of stuff, because all it was one fact and then another fact and then another fact and then another fact and then another fact and another fact. So there wasn't any sort of rhythm to it or highlights in the overall presentation of information. So what he did was he went back and looked at some early philosophers and all that sort of stuff, and he found a very, very simple rhythm. And it's depicted by a number of different people in different ways. There's another lady called Nancy Dwady, who runs a design firm over in the US, who helped with Al Gore's presentation on inconvenient truth, some of the foundational sort of information about climate change and that sort of stuff. So there's different ways that people present this concept, but Randy's, I think, is a very, very simple structure, which is the concept of and, but, and therefore. So it's a very simple story structure, but it works very well, which is that the and is setting up what you're going to talk about. So it's sort of an introduction. The but is, okay, but within what we're talking about, I found this particular exception. And it might be a positive exception, it might be a negative exception or whatever. But given that I found that exception, therefore, what do we take away from this? What's the action that we should take, or where are we going to dive a little bit more into? So the simplest form of a story then is and, right, beginning, but, the middle, and therefore, what are we going to do with that, right? Otherwise, if you don't have those three ingredients, people often leave off the therefore, right? So they'll have an introduction and they'll have a whole lot of buts, right? So here's a whole lot of insights, and then they end, right? And there's no action, there's no conclusion, there's no, well, okay, what am I going to do with this sort of thing? So by putting that therefore on the end, so it's called the ABT structure, the and, but, and therefore structure, it really creates I think the simplest form of a story. And that's what I would say is my sort of simplest description of what a story is. But a story fundamentally is presenting your facts in a complete context. And that should begin with some sort of overall context. Why are we talking about this? What is it? What's the overall data set that I'm talking about? What's the exception that I want to highlight to you? And why am I presenting this to you? That then becomes a story. Anything less than that is really not a story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, super clear. So thanks so much for sharing that. And yeah, I've also seen lots of gone to many presentations about storytelling and all of this kind of stuff, and I like the simplicity of that. And I mean, as keynote speakers as well, we weave this into our keynote speeches all the time. Obviously, sometimes the and's a bit longer, the but's a bit longer, but the therefore of, okay, what am I going to do with this information is really key. And then I see that in imagining a data story or visualization, which again, it doesn't have to be a long form thing, right? It's just, this is the end, this is what I found out, and then that action orientated or the therefore being action orientated, what am I going to do about this, which circles back to what you were talking about earlier about the why. That has to link to that therefore, which I think simple but really powerful way of describing stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the good thing about it is that if you've thought about your audience ahead of time and why they're interested in it, then you can look at your presentation overall, and whether it's an interactive dashboard or whether it's a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document that you put together. If you've thought about who you're presenting to and why you're presenting it to them, then you can look at your final result and say, well, again, how useful is that now to solving that original problem that we had? So it gives you a really nice framework to do a critique as well, whether it's a critique of your own work or whether it's a critique of somebody else. And then you use the broader vocabulary that we've been developing to sort of, give a more elaborate critique, right? You don't just simply say, oh, it doesn't look good. right? You say, well, why doesn't it look good? It's because it's too confusing, or I don't know where to focus my attention, or you haven't given a conclusion, or whatever the case may be. So we can use these sort of words to sort of help provide, as I said, a better, more elaborate critique, rather than just simply saying, well, yeah, it looks okay, but, this now sort of gives you the ability to sort of have that conversation.
You talked a little bit about just medium, so like how we're going to present this information. So I guess in your work, are you mainly dealing with, say, software, Power BI we mentioned briefly earlier, or I don't know, I'm thinking about what's the decision making that goes on when you're working with clients around what medium that they should choose, depending on what they're trying to, I guess, show or explain when they're doing a data visualization or story.
Yeah, so when I'm talking about data visualization storytelling principles, I try to avoid technology primarily, because it's much more about the fundamentals, the concepts, and that sort of stuff. But I do end up I do end up doing some workshopy sort of type things, some show and tell where people could follow along and that sort of stuff. And sometimes I'll use a combination of Excel and PowerPoint, right? Yep. And another one I might use Power BI and create a more interactive experience. What I generally would say in terms of the technology is not as important, I don't think, as what the experience is you're trying to create. And again, when I talk about narrative, one of the things that I do touch upon is the idea that narrative is a spectrum. There's a spectrum of narrative, and I define the spectrum as being, at one extreme, you have what you might call the tell part of the narrative. And that's where you have developed your story, you've got very precise insights, all of that sort of stuff. And what you're really in is you're in presentation mode. And what you're really trying to do in presentation mode is you're trying to inform and motivate, right? So that's the purpose. And if you're on that end of the spectrum, then you're probably going to be using something like PowerPoint or an infographic poster, right? Where your thoughts are already well formed and you're just presenting it. So the technology sort of comes out of your position on this spectrum, right? So one end of the spectrum is the tell end of the spectrum. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, you're in what I would call the discovery end of the spectrum. And that's when you have maybe very little narrative, right? You haven't yet formed your insights. And at that point in the spectrum, what you might be trying to do is to validate whether the data that you're looking at is even appropriate for the goal that you have, or the analysis that you're being asked to do. And so in the discovery mode, you might be just simply validating the data, in which case you're going to need a different set of tools. You might need data profiling tools, and you might need more statistical tools in order to sort of try and understand what the makeup of the data is and all that sort of stuff, because you're still on the narrative spectrum, but you haven't yet formed the opinions and the advice and all of that sort of stuff. At that point, you're really just trying to discover whether you've got the right data or not. And then somewhere in the middle is where people often find themselves at the moment. And that's when we're building what I call the explore part of the narrative. And that's where you're providing probably a dashboard, an interactive dashboard. And the interactive dashboard is not yet the tell, right? So you haven't yet formed an exact set of outcomes. You're allowing somebody to explore the data. But equally, you're not in the discovery phase, in the sense that it's not completely open-ended either. Because when you create a dashboard, you're creating a curated environment. And that curated environment needs to be thought out. And it's probably going to have a different set of tools, right? So, if you're in that explore mode in the middle somewhere, you might be using a Tableau or a Power BI or, one of these interactive visualizations. If you're at the tell end of the spectrum, you might be using PowerPoint, you might be using Word, you might be using some of these presentation graphic tools, like a Canvas or something like that, where you have just simply a simple data set and you're trying to animate it, right, to maybe create a race chart or something like that. And so it might not be completely static, but you're presenting a visualization because you have a point that you're trying to get across, right? And as I said, then if you're down in the discovery spectrum, it might be something completely different. It might be that you use Excel for all of that spectrum. You know, it might start with Excel and you might explore your data or discover your data, work out whether you've got the right data. You might use Excel in the middle to explore it and filter it and unfilter it and do some statistical analysis. And then you might end up building the charts in Excel in order to just simply copy and paste it and put it into Word or put it into PowerPoint, right? So technology is a question that I ask after you determine what point on that spectrum you're trying to really address. And then you can start to sort of think about what would be the technology that's required for that part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even like as you were talking there about the discovery phase, as the creator or the data analyst or whoever you are, maybe you're not maybe you just happen to have the data, the custodian of the data that you're playing around with. Visualization can then also help us to make a decision about where we go next as well. So we then become the creator and the decision maker at the same time, which is it's an interesting concept too, because I bring in data into my Python, and then I'm like, oh, I want to know how many things are this or that, the other. Yes, it can give me in a table, but as soon as I put it in a heat map or something like that, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, now I can go. So it's an exploratory discovery tool at the same time, which is interesting to think about.
Absolutely, yes. And it certainly has a different set of visualizations. As you say, it might be more like data profiling visualizations and those sorts of things. And this idea of that spectrum is to suggest that it's a continuum as well. So you might be moving across the whole thing constantly, right? Because you might start down in that discovery area and realize, oh, you've got some interesting data here. And then you move into explore and you actually start to explore that data. And then you might say, oh, I found something interesting. I better bookmark that, or I'll take a screenshot or whatever it is, right? And I might realize, oh, that might be something I'll put into a presentation later, right? And then you might come back into your data again. You might start exploring it a little bit. And then you might say, oh, okay, I don't quite have every data element that I need. I might have to go back and get some more data. So then I have to go back to discovery. So it can be a continuum, and it might be that you end up in the one tool that can, covers that whole continuum. Like, again, I could use Power BI to do data profiling and do some very basic visualizations of the data itself just to validate the data. And then I might build an interactive experience that allows people to find some interesting insights. And then when we find those interesting insights, then I might actually create some bookmarks in Power BI that helps me actually create a story. So sometimes even in Power BI, I will use a series of bookmarks to actually create a series of stories that people step through. So I might have a bookmark that says, here's all the data that we're using. And then I might have the next bookmark is bookmark number 2. And then bookmark number 2 highlights that particular element of the data and says, oh, there's an exception here. So that's the but. And then I might press on another button and it progresses to another bookmark, which says, therefore, we need to focus on these items because they're above or below that threshold or something like that. So you can actually create, narrative and story in some of these tools as well. And in fact, even Tableau actually has what they call a story feature, where they create these frames of a story. And you've already gone through the discovery process, and you've already gone through the explore process, and you build the story in that tool as well. So tools and what your objectives are will change a little bit on what mode of that narrative you're in at the time.
And I've used both, and I use Tableau a lot in my masters. I haven't picked it up for a while, but then being able to, there's so many different tools now that, I think exactly what you said, starting with what we're trying to do first, and then knowing that there is very likely a tool that can help us to do that, rather than focusing, I want to use Tableau to do, or whenever it is.
And even just identifying what mode of thinking you're in at the time. Like, am I in insight discovery? Like, am I in that middle explore mode where I'm exploring the data set and I'm looking for those little nuggets? Or am I back at discovery where I'm just trying to make sure that the data is fit for purpose? Or am I now already in a mode where I've actually found some interesting things and I want to now share that with some people, right? So just knowing what mode you're in will help you think about what the features of a particular tool or whether you should be changing the tool.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit around, I guess, examples of data visualizations. You've shared some examples that you've worked on. Is there any other impactful examples that maybe either you've worked on or that you know of that have left an impression on you?
Yeah, that have left an impression on me. I think there's always lots that inspire me constantly. Some inspire me because I'd like to try and reproduce them. Some inspire me because I think they change the way that I thought about a topic, right? And they're probably the best ones, right? The ones that, shift your mindset, right? And, they often say that the best stories are when you come to a new insight, right? When you suddenly realize something that you hadn't been aware of before. And so I think two that were very powerful, and they're not always immediately identifiable as a data visualization, ironically, right? So the two I'm going to mention is, one is a project associated with the 9/11 memorial in New York. And I don't know whether you've ever had the opportunity to visit. There's a thing called the reflected pools, the square sort of reflected pools, and the names of the people that are around the plaques, right? So you know that, right? And if you've ever seen any images of it, it's quite moving in just the sense that it's a moving tribute. And the names are very tangible, right? They're very, very important. What most people don't realize, though, is that those brass plaques where the names are on is actually algorithmically determined. So they're not actually in alphabetical order. Obviously, they're around the individual tower. So there's two sort of bases to the tower. So obviously the names are grouped by tower. However, there's more than that. They're actually grouped based on things like the company that they're part of, that they were part of. There are family members that are grouped together. There are people who are friends that are grouped together. So in fact, when you start to look at it as a data visualization, you start to see patterns in the way that the names are grouped. And you realize that there's much more meaning to it than you might have originally thought, in the sense that it's not the classic alphabetical order, but now it actually has true emotional connection and meaning to the way that the names are laid out, which I think is something that really changed the way that I sort of see these tributes and those sorts of things. Really quite dramatic. Also has a very personal effect on me because I was actually in New York when 9/11 happened. So,
wow.
So there's sort of that aspect to it as well. The other one that I think, again, and maybe it's just simply related to a tragic story, maybe these are the ones that have the greatest impact on us. But there's another fantastic visualization that was done by a group at one stage that talked about the impact of the number of deaths associated with guns in the US. And the visualization basically did an arc that represented every individual in a given year. And these arcs basically drew the projected arc of that individual based on a sort of a random distribution of life expectancy. So based on their ethnicity, their gender, when they were born, in terms of, just generally what the distribution of life expectancy would be. And so what the chart did was that it drew an arc of every single person. And the first thing was that there was a lot of these arcs. It was terrible, right? There was 10,000 people who might have died in a given year. So there's a lot of these individual arcs. And they drew as a little animation. So they built up very, very rapidly. The arc itself then was coloured. The first part of the arc was their life, and the second part of the arc was coloured grey. So it was a gold line initially, and then it turned to a grey when the person passed away. And there was a number at the top that indicated the number of deaths, and that itself was dramatic. But then what it did was it calculated the number of lost years to society. And so what you realized was it wasn't just simply 10,000 deaths, but it was 100,000 years of lost life, right, that the world experienced or the US experienced just based on gun deaths alone. And so I felt that was an extraordinarily compelling one. And each of the lines, if you actually clicked on the line actually drilled down to a news article about that individual. So you could read about the circumstances and that sort of stuff. So it was also very personal. So those are two that sort of, I think, have left a very, clear mark on me, because I think they gave me new insight into information, but they were also these very sort of personal experiences.
Yeah, the gun deaths one is by Periscope. And
that's right, by Periscope, correct. Yep.
And it has been very impactful. Lots of people that I talked to mention this one, and I shared it on my LinkedIn recently, actually, as if you haven't seen it, go and look at it, because it also gives a lot of I think they last updated in 2018, but then it would be interesting to see what that next and reading why they did it and how they developed it was also really interesting, and like the process that they went to be able to do it. So, and I think you touched on the use of like numbers, those big numbers, thinking about it in a different way. The use of color is really powerful. And obviously it's an emotional topic, so they already have that to, I guess, lean on or draw in. But I think that's a really great example. And
also having that drill down to the detail, I think, is really
yes. You're right.
To go down and see those individual stories is very
humanizes it. Well, yeah.
There's an example that I actually build out in one of my classes using a different data set, so similar sort of data set, but it's one by the Committee for the Protection of Journalism, so it's CPJ. Mm-hmm. And it has a very extensive data set that's available via an API as well, which makes it interesting to get access to. But it's every journalist who has died over the last, I think it started in 1992, I think is the earliest data, but it goes through to current times. And it shows the journalist, it shows the country that they died in, it showed what their job was, what medium they operated in, what the type of, was it a friendly fire, or was it government, or was it something else that killed the person? And so it is a really interesting one that we end up in the class. We actually build out a visualization around that data set, doing it very respectfully, because it's a very respectful, we need to be respectful of this data. And at the same time, creating a very interesting interactive visualization that also gives you that drill down to the individual story and that sort of stuff as well. So there are these other very compelling data sets out there as well.
Absolutely. And I think just to go back, we're about to wrap, but just to go back to the memorial, again, like really, I guess, impactful. And I guess that different lens of thinking of it as a data visualization is really powerful. The physicalization of data is something I'm really interested in, because, there's so much opportunity to, I guess, bring in the creativity, the art, and in sense of art, the power that art can bring with it and influence, and the real impact it can have on communities and starting conversations is really powerful.
And potentially the permanency of it as well, right? It has a different aspect when you see it physically. There's a fantastic person, if you're probably aware, a lady called Laura Flick. Do you know the name Laura Flick?
No.
So definitely look up Laura Flick, because that's one of her specialities, is she actually turns visualization into physical manifestations.
Great.
So blocks of wood, for example, instead of bar charts. And she did a wonderful mural on the side of a building that actually depicted the traffic densities of the intersections around the building, but it was actually ended up being this multi-story mural on the side of a building. So definitely look up Laura Flick. She definitely very passionate about exactly the topic you just described, which is physically manifesting data sets.
Amazing. Thanks so much. So many good things in there. We'll have to wrap up. I just want to end on one last question, which is any suggestions for listeners to use data storytelling in their own work and life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really important that we do try to make sure that the effort that we go into creating data, because quite often it takes, days, weeks, if not months to actually create this data. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we give the data the greatest opportunity to have the influence or the impact that we would like it to have. And just simply presenting individual charts loses that value, I think, that we've intrinsically got in there. And so by wrapping the information and ideally the insights that we're trying to share with people inside a story is going to make it more memorable. It's going to make it more engaging. Hopefully, if you craft it right, it will make it more actionable as well. And so there are so many benefits out of thinking about beyond the data points and thinking about what is the context that you're trying to present this in, and then shaping your story around that context and then giving the information the greatest opportunity to have the impact that it really deserves based on the effort you put in. I think that's what I would really say about storytelling.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. It's been great to have this chat with you. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us on the podcast and also this amazing source of data for my PhD. So thank you.
Oh, it's been my absolute pleasure. And feel free to give me a buzz, link up with me on LinkedIn anytime you like. I'm always around.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Paul. I look forward to our next conversation. We'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Bye.
Thanks, Zoe.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes at zoeether.com/podcast. That's zoeeather.com/podcast. Have you got a question for me or one of our guests? We'd love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at hello@mysmart.community. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on LinkedIn too. And hey, ratings and reviews are always welcome. They help more smart humans just like you find the show. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.